If you're planning to pitch a beautiful children's book, or any book for that matter, successfully to any media outlet, then this video is for you. This is part 2 of my short podcasts for writer series. And while this is specifically to get onto podcasts, I know that what I'm sharing today will change the way you pitch yourself and your beautiful children's book to any media outlet. It has certainly changed my world by changing the way I think about these things, and so I hope it'll do the same for you as well. Hi there, I'm Eevi, an award-winning children's author and ghostwriter over on eevijones.com and the creator of Children's Book University. I create videos specifically for children's authors, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss my weekly videos. In the first part of the series, we looked at why going on podcasts can be so beneficial to us in our children's books, what podcasts to approach so that they are a perfect match for us in our children's book, and where to find these podcasts. If you haven't watched the first part just yet, I've added the link to it in the description below, so make sure you watch that one as well. In the second part, we'll look at the 5 deep dive parameters that help us determine whether our previously identified podcasts are worth reaching out to, especially if it is a paid podcast. The 3 main questions we'll want to ask and keep in mind if we want to draft a successful outreach message, and the 4 biggest do's and don'ts when it comes to the actual writing of our outreach message. So let's jump right in. The way we reach out always depends on a number of things. The 2 initial questions we'll want to ask ourselves are these right here. Is this for a paid or free podcast appearance? And what type of podcast is it? Meaning, what category is it in? How we answer these questions will determine how we'll go about approaching our previously identified podcasts. For example, over these past couple of years, more and more paid interview-based podcasts have emerged. For those, I urge you to really deep dive into the next part of this video, where we'll look at how to evaluate a podcast to see if a financial investment here is really worth it, and to do this deep dive before you're approaching these podcasts. And the reason we will want to determine what category the podcasts are in is because this will help us determine how to pitch ourselves to them. A pitch sent to a podcast that always interviews authors will be different from the pitch sent to a podcast that is tailored toward moms, for example. And a pitch sent to a podcast specifically for business development will be different from a pitch sent to a podcast for personal growth. So knowing the category of each podcast we're reaching out to is really important. So let's look at how to determine whether or not a podcast is a good podcast to reach out to. Here, I always like to perform a sort of deep dive, especially for paid podcasts. Now, a quick side note here regarding paid podcasts is that I would only recommend them in 2 instances. 1, if it's a specific podcast that you really want to appear on, like a personal dream podcast, so to speak. And 2, if it's a very well-known podcast with a publicly shared number of monthly downloads and where you know the audience would be perfect for your message and your book. So whenever I'm performing a deep dive, I look at 5 things. The first thing I look at during a deep dive will save you so much time, so please make sure you'll make this your first step. Here we'll want to determine if the podcast is actually an interview-based podcast, and that's important because only interview-based podcasts require a guest. If a podcast doesn't require guests, well then they probably won't invite us onto their show, right? And this may be obvious, but not necessarily something most think about. One way we can figure out really quickly whether or not a podcast is interview-based is to simply look at the titles of each of their already published episodes. Most interview-based podcasts include the name of their guests in their episode titles, like this entrepreneurial podcast did right here. So if the majority of their episode titles includes a name, then it's pretty safe to assume that they invite guests onto their podcast, and that's exactly what we are looking for. The second thing to look at during our deep dive is each podcast's statistics on who their main audience is in terms of demographics, the number of downloads per episode or month, and how many podcast episodes they record each month. If it is a paid appearance, the third thing we want to look at during our deep dive is to see what it includes. Is it just the interview, or do they perhaps also help push out every recorded episode by, for example, sending out emails to their audience and by posting on social media? Because if this is a paid appearance, we'll want to make sure the host pushes their episodes out as much as possible. This information is usually provided on the podcaster's website. This right here are some statistics from a podcast I appeared on before called Entrepreneur on Fire. This one is mainly for entrepreneurs, so not really our target audience as children's authors, but I thought it's still a great example. So up top, we see all that is included in their appearances, which is an opportunity to share our CTA, which stands for our call to action, show notes, emails to their audience, and multiple social media posts. Now, a CTA or call to action allows us as the guest to share any of the steps we would like the listener to take next, be it to visit our own website by sharing our URL with them, or to invite them to purchase our book, or any other action we want them to take. So having an opportunity to share our own CTA with the podcaster's audience is really valuable. So we'll want to make sure we are being provided with that type of opportunity. Show notes are also very valuable. Show notes are usually presented below each episode on the podcast host's website that shares a bit more about each of their guests, including a link to their own website or to their book over on Amazon, for example. Now, on the bottom of the screenshot here, we see some of this podcast statistics, including how long they have been around, any podcasting awards they may have won, what distribution platforms they are using for each of their podcast episodes, and how many listeners they have per month and more. Now, looking at these numbers, this is a really big podcast. And in last week's video of this podcast series, I mentioned to start small and to then work our way up. So keep that in mind as you're doing your own deep dives. Something I wanted to make sure to mention and include here is a quick, really important side note. When I went on this interview over on Entrepreneur on Fire, appearing on this podcast was still absolutely free. I didn't have to pay, but because it was free, it was really competitive to get onto the show. And so the selection was solely based on how one reached out. So how we are crafting our outreach message is really important. Now, this podcast is more than $3,000 per interview, so these deep dives are even more important. And so what I'd like you to really make sure you do is to set some sort of budget even before you begin your deep dive. It's perfectly okay if you decide to go for free podcasts only. In fact, I have never paid for any of my podcast interviews, and I have been on pretty well-known ones. But if you already have a very specific podcast in mind that you really want to be on, set a budget beforehand and then really try to stick to that predetermined budget. The fourth thing to look at during our deep dive is each podcast's rating, if they have one, along with some of their testimonials. This right here is a screenshot of another podcast I'm so fortunate to have been on. Again, this is a podcast for mostly entrepreneurs, so not quite that relevant for authors. And that one was definitely on my dream list of podcasts that I briefly mentioned in the previous video of this podcast series. Not so much for my books, but for my children's book university. These are this podcast's numbers over on iTunes, where we can see the rating, the average length of the episodes, how frequently they appear, and more. And the fifth thing we will want to make sure to do during our deep dive is to listen to some episodes, at least one, if not 2 or 3. That way we get an overall feel for the podcast and its host, so we can see if we would be a great fit for them and their audience. And this would also help us personalize our outreach message. And later on, once we know that we will appear as a guest on a certain podcast, I'd encourage you to listen to even more episodes of that podcast, because by doing so, we can see if there is some sort of pattern or specific structure to each of their episodes, which in turn can help us prepare for our interview. I personally think that doing these types of deep dives is really important. They make sure the podcast is in alignment with our own values. The podcast's audience is the type of audience we wish to reach with our book, and the podcast audience is the type of audience that will be interested in our book. Because in the end, we'll want to make sure we are making good use of our very limited time, right? The time we would spend on reaching out and the time we would spend appearing on any given podcast. So once we've done our homework and have done some research and have decided what podcasts we would like to reach out to, we are ready to prepare our outreach message, which we'll look at next. If you have watched my videos on how to best reach out over on social media as an author, you may already know that personalizing our outreach message is really important. Again, if you haven't watched these social media videos yet, I went ahead and added the links in the description below. And so to draft a successful outreach message, there are 3 main questions we'll want to ask and keep in mind. 1. Is this a paid or free podcast? If it is a paid podcast, the outreach is a bit different. Here, the way we reach out is still important, but not as important. With paid podcasts, it's mostly a matter of filling out an online form. It's less about drafting an actual personalized outreach message, so definitely keep that in mind. 2, how big is this podcast? During our deep dive, we should have already determined that it's an interview-based podcast, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't move on to reaching out. So here, a great rule of thumb is that the smaller the podcast, meaning the newer the podcast and the smaller their audience, the easier it will be to get onto that podcast. And just as I shared before, we'll want to start small and work our way up. That way, we can also hone in our message and practice being interviewed. And we have something we can mention and point to once we do reach out to bigger podcasts. And 3, the third question we'll want to ask ourselves is, what is the main theme of that podcast? That's really important because that's the angle we'll want to use when we are pitching ourselves as a guest. If it is a podcast specifically to promote books, then it is most likely a paid one and is often considered to be a promotional author service, something that I have mentioned in the first part of this series, and that I personally don't believe to be the best investment, mainly because it doesn't reach the audience we are trying to reach. Because more often than not, its main audience are fellow authors who are looking to promote their own books. They're usually not listening to the podcast to learn about other books. Now, when it comes to successfully pitching to a free podcast, not a paid one, it's never about us and our book, but about the podcaster's audience. If we understand that, then we have won half of the battle because that's something so many don't know or simply don't understand. When I first started out, both as an author and as a business owner, the only thing I focused on was my book and my message that I wanted to share. I still had this mindset that my book is so great that of course everyone wants to hear about it. And of course every show wants to share it and talk about it. But in reality, unless it's a paid interview, this is just not true, which is also why so many of my first attempts to get onto a podcast failed. So if you only take one thing away from this video today, let it be this. It's never about us and our book. It's always about the podcasters and their audience. So what does that mean? How should we then reach out? That's where the first part of the series helps and comes in as well, where I shared how to find and choose the best podcasts for us in our books. So if you haven't yet, make sure you watch that as well. Because what podcasts we are reaching out to and what each podcast's main purpose is really important. We'll essentially want to make sure that whatever the audience is interested in relates somehow to us and the topic of our book. Because again, that's the angle we'll want to use to pitch to that podcast. Now, that angle or relation between an audience's interests and our book's topic can be either rather broad, but it can also be very specific. So let's look at a few examples so you can see what I mean. As an example for a broad audience, let's say a podcast's audience consists mainly of moms. Then we can approach this from a parenting angle. So let's say our book is a book about friendship and being kind. Then instead of pitching our book and simply talking about our book, we can pitch it from the angle of how hard it is nowadays to ensure our kids are kind to each other, or how hard it was for your daughter to make friends, or how your son's friendships have really helped him through tough times. And because because you realized this importance, you wrote a story that shares these same experiences and essentially helps other kids make new friends or help them understand the importance of being kind. Is bullying on the rise, or is it finally going down? Are there any recent studies that would support that? Are there any recent events that were covered in the news that most will have heard of? And what does that mean? How may books play a role here? How could they further that mission? So by framing things that way and showing the host how this insight might be really interesting or relevant to their audience, we'll help them see the value of having you on their show. As an example for a specific audience, let's say your book is talking about adoption and perhaps shows it from the perspective of a child that is about to become a new brother or sister. Let's say you found a podcast that helps couples prepare for the adoption of a child. Instead of simply pitching your book, think about how these parents might be trying to prepare their children for this adoption. What challenges might they be facing with this? What questions might they have? Or may their kids have? What personal experiences did you have with this? What difficulties did you go through? Was this perhaps what prompted you to write your children's book? Then how could your book fit in here? What problems would it solve, or what value would it bring to the audience? Let's look at one more example where we are a professional in a specific field or area. Let's say you are a nutritionist and your book is a story about a little boy that learns to enjoy eating broccoli. Here, pitching this from the angle of a nutritionist can be really powerful and valuable to the audience. What are some statistics on kids eating enough vegetables? What are some known ways to get kids to eat more vegetables? And how can your book support this effort? Looking at these examples, I would like you to see this almost as the telling of a story the podcast audience can relate to, a story where you then come in and share your book. Not any book, but a book that can help that audience overcome certain things they might be going through right now, or that their kids might be going through right now. So again, it's not about our book. It's about how we can help and support that podcaster's audience. If you can convey this in your outreach message, you're more than halfway there, because framing things that way from a giving and not taking perspective and showing the host how this insight might be really interesting or relevant to their audience will help them see the value of having you on their show. Not your book, but your insight on a topic that is relevant to them. Because for the host, it's never about the value this interview brings to you, the author, but the value you bring to their audience. Now, when it comes to the drafting of our actual outreach message, I wanted to share a few do's and don'ts, those that I see over and over again. So really do take those to heart because they will make such a big difference. 1, do keep your email short and to the point. I receive so many messages each week, and when a message is really long, I'm already exhausted just by looking at it. And while I do try to respond to most of my messages, it's the longer ones that tend to get pushed back simply because I don't have the time to read long messages. So the shorter and more concise you keep it, the more likely it is that your message gets read by the podcast host. 2, don't send your message as one single big chunk of text. Instead, break your text up into smaller, much more digestible paragraphs. It'll make it so much easier to read and also just lowers the resistance of wanting to read it in the first place. This makes me laugh because, again, it's something that makes me not want to read a message. So it ends up at the end of my response list. So when reaching out to hosts, we'll want to make sure it is as easy as possible for them to read our message. 3, do personalize it. I know that's something we hear all the time, but so often people just ignore the simple thing we can do to create an instant personal connection, be it by simply using that person's name or by showing with a sentence or two that we are familiar with their podcast and that we have actually listened to some of their episodes. For example, what was one major takeaway you had from one of their previous episodes? How did you learn about their podcast? What made you reach out to them? So set yourself apart by being courteous, humble, and appreciative. And lastly, 4, don't give up. Reaching out like this is truly just a numbers game. The more we pitch, the better we get and the higher our chances to get onto a podcast. So don't give up, no matter the number of no's. And if you get lots of no's, take a step back and start by pitching to smaller podcasts. Patience and persistence are everything. I know this was quite a lot to take in, especially if you've never reached out to any media outlets. Just know that this knowledge is so important and will make all the difference. It certainly did for me, because as soon as I started pitching from a giving rather than taking perspective, my pitches were accepted left and right. And I have been on really big media outlets, be it podcasts like Entrepreneur on Fire or places like Forbes. So be creative with your outreach, personalize your message, be patient with yourself, and be persistent. I really hope that today's video was able to show you how to reach out in a meaningful way so that a host would love to have you on their show, not to promote your book, but because they know you would bring value to their audience. The podcasting world is a beautiful one with so many amazing opportunities. So I'm really looking forward to the next part in the series to help you make podcast interviews be part of your marketing strategy of your beautiful children's book. I hope you found this video really helpful in preparing your outreach. Stay tuned for part 3. In the meantime, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't yet. It really encourages me to keep making free videos for you just like this one. Here's to your very own beautiful outreach message. Bye!